At Harvard Law Symposium, Dershowitz told Obama, "I taught real law while you played politics." Obama's response about academic achievement versus real-world impact left the professor speechless. Welcome to Real Life Stories. Before we dive into this incredible academic showdown, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from, and if you believe stories like this need to be told, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like this video, because what you'll learn tonight reveals the clash between academic arrogance and real-world leadership. The Ames courtroom at Harvard Law School was packed beyond capacity for the prestigious Constitutional Leadership in the Modern Era Symposium. The historic courtroom, with its dark wood paneling and traditional academic atmosphere, had hosted countless legal debates over the decades, but this evening promised something special. The panel featured some of the most prominent figures in American legal and political history. Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz, now 85, sat at the mahogany panel table with his characteristic air of intellectual superiority. Beside him, former President Barack Obama, 62, reviewed his notes with the quiet confidence that had defined his public career. The symposium was intended to explore how constitutional law principles translate into practical governance. The audience included current Harvard Law students, distinguished faculty, federal judges, and prominent attorneys who had traveled from across the country to witness this rare gathering of legal minds. The first hour proceeded smoothly, with both men offering thoughtful perspectives on Supreme Court precedents, executive power, and constitutional interpretation. Obama spoke about the challenges of applying constitutional principles while governing, while Dershowitz focused on theoretical frameworks and historical precedents. But as the evening progressed, subtle tensions began to emerge. Dershowitz, accustomed to being the most prominent figure in any academic setting, seemed increasingly irritated by the respectful attention Obama commanded from the audience. During a discussion of executive privilege, Dershowitz made his first pointed comment. "It's easy to discuss constitutional theory when you've spent 8 years bending constitutional principles to fit political expediency." Obama responded with characteristic composure. "Professor, I'd argue that governing requires understanding how constitutional principles work in practice, not just in theory." The audience sensed the underlying tension, but assumed it was merely academic disagreement. They had no idea what was about to unfold. During the break, Dershowitz approached Obama near the coffee service in the faculty lounge. What happened in that private moment would set the stage for one of the most devastating public confrontations in Harvard Law School history. "Barack," Dershowitz said, his voice carrying the condescending tone he had perfected over decades of academia, "I hope you don't mind some constructive criticism from someone who actually understands constitutional law." Obama looked up from his coffee, meeting Dershowitz's gaze with quiet attention. "Of course, Professor. I'm always open to learning." Dershowitz's smile was thin and superior. The problem with politicians who happen to have law degrees is that they think winning elections makes them constitutional scholars. Real constitutional law requires years of rigorous academic study, not political campaigning. "You were law review president, yes," Dershowitz continued, "but that's essentially a student political position. I've been teaching constitutional law longer than you've been alive. There's a difference between student activities and actual legal scholarship." When the session resumed, Dershowitz interrupted Obama's discussion about constitutional interpretation in crisis situations. "If I may," Dershowitz said, raising his hand with academic authority, "I think it's important to distinguish between political decision-making and actual constitutional law expertise." The audience fell silent, recognizing that this was no longer academic discourse, but something more personal. "I spent decades teaching real constitutional law to serious students," Dershowitz said, his voice gaining strength. "Not political science courses disguised as legal education, but rigorous constitutional scholarship. While President Obama was playing student politics and then campaigning, I was training the legal minds who actually argue constitutional cases before the Supreme Court." The insult was unmistakable. Several faculty members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Professor Dershowitz," Obama said, his voice calm but carrying a new edge, "I appreciate your dedication to legal education. Teaching is certainly important work." "It's not just important," Dershowitz interrupted. "It's foundational. I taught real law while you played politics. I shaped constitutional thinking while you gave campaign speeches. There's a difference between academic rigor and political theater." Obama paused, looking directly at Dershowitz with the steady gaze that had once commanded the attention of world leaders. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the silent courtroom. Professor, you're absolutely right that academic scholarship is important. You've spent decades teaching constitutional theory to students who go on to argue cases and shape legal doctrine. That's valuable work, and I respect it deeply. Dershowitz nodded, clearly pleased with what he interpreted as acknowledgement of his superiority. But, Obama continued, I'd like to share a different perspective on what constitutes real law and constitutional understanding. Obama stood up, his presence immediately commanding the room in a way that decades of political leadership had made instinctive. You mentioned that you taught constitutional law while I played politics. Let me tell you what my political career actually involved from a constitutional perspective. Obama's voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable authority in his tone that made everyone in the room lean forward. I didn't just read about the balance between executive power and congressional oversight. I lived it every day for 8 years. When Congress attempted to use its investigative powers to paralyze executive functions, I didn't write academic papers about separation of powers. I had to make real-time constitutional decisions that affected millions of people. The audience was completely silent, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. You taught students about the president's role as commander-in-chief, Obama continued. I actually held that role. When military advisors recommended actions that pushed the boundaries of presidential war powers, I couldn't retreat to academic theory. I had to make constitutional decisions knowing that lives, international law, and congressional relations hung in the balance. Dershowitz's confident expression was beginning to waver. You lecture about the Fourth Amendment and executive surveillance powers, Obama pressed on. I sat in the Situation Room making real constitutional decisions about NSA programs, balancing national security needs against constitutional privacy protections, not theoretical balancing, actual decisions with real consequences for American civil liberties. Obama pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. Professor, you mentioned my law review presidency was just student politics. Let me tell you what that experience actually involved. He consulted his notes. As law review president, I oversaw the publication of scholarship that included constitutional analysis cited by the Supreme Court in 14 different decisions. The articles published during my tenure contributed to legal precedents that are still being applied today. But more importantly, Obama continued, my real constitutional education didn't end at Harvard. It continued through community organizing, where I learned how constitutional principles affect real people's lives. It continued through the Illinois Senate, where I saw how constitutional theories translate into actual legislation. Obama's voice grew stronger. It continued through the U.S. Senate, where I participated in constitutional debates about judicial nominees, executive powers, and civil liberties. And it was completed during 8 years as president, where every major decision involved constitutional considerations. Dershowitz tried to interrupt, but Obama continued with controlled authority. Professor, you taught students about constitutional crises. I managed actual constitutional crises. You wrote about the president's appointment power. I actually appointed 2 Supreme Court justices whose constitutional philosophies will shape American law for decades. Obama closed his notebook and looked directly at Dershowitz. You taught theory about how constitutional principles should work in government. I spent 8 years discovering how they actually do work, and sometimes don't work, when real lives and real consequences are involved. The devastation was systematic and complete. Dershowitz sat silent, his face showing the reality of his situation. He had just been outclassed by someone whose constitutional experience dwarfed his own. Now, Obama said, his tone softening but retaining its authority, I don't diminish the value of your academic work. Constitutional scholarship provides the intellectual foundation that practical governance builds upon. But suggesting that classroom teaching represents real law, while actual constitutional governance is merely playing politics, reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how constitutional principles operate in practice. Obama sat back down, but his presence continued to dominate the room. Real constitutional law isn't just about understanding precedents and theories. It's about applying those principles under pressure with incomplete information, knowing that your decisions will affect millions of people and be scrutinized by history. Dershowitz finally found his voice, but it came out smaller than before. President Obama, I didn't mean to suggest. Professor, Obama interrupted gently, you said exactly what you meant. You wanted to establish that your academic credentials make you a more serious constitutional scholar than someone who spent 8 years actually applying constitutional law at the highest level of government. The difference between us, Obama concluded, isn't that you taught real law while I played politics. The difference is that you taught about constitutional law while I lived it. You prepared students to understand constitutional principles. I took responsibility for implementing them. The remainder of the session was subdued, with Dershowitz offering only brief defensive responses while Obama continued to demonstrate the depth of constitutional understanding that comes from actually governing under constitutional constraints. Within hours, #Constitutional Masterclass was trending. Legal scholars and political commentators praised Obama's devastating response to academic arrogance. Law schools began using the exchange as a case study in the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. The incident became legendary at Harvard Law School, demonstrating that real constitutional expertise comes not just from teaching about the Constitution, but from actually governing under its constraints and protections.